and also from Irish Water in the Republic of Ireland. So in this webinar, I'm going to be reviewing the general response so far, identifying lessons learned and considering what next. It's in 4 parts: setting the scene, where we are, what's been learned about preparing for the pandemic, what's been learned about reacting to the pandemic, and some thoughts about what happens next with the recovery from the pandemic. Well, what happened with the Komnet Abwasser, perhaps typical of many organisations, we had a meeting. This in the picture is the last meeting before lockdown, and all subsequent meetings have been online. They focused on 3 things then. How was the disease and the virus transmitted? What role did water and sanitation play, and what do they need to worry about concerning occupational health and safety? And from that first meeting, they agreed 3 principles. They had to be very careful about the occupational safety for their staff, avoid unnecessarily risks, but concluded on the evidence available that if they applied the usual hygiene regulations that apply to working around sewage, then that should be sufficient for the moment. It was the last time they met together, as I said, and they then did 4 things subsequently. They regularly discussed and shared plans with each other of how they were coping with the pandemic. They made a decision to open up their discussions to other sewer network owners and also to publish information in English. So we did a series of 3 English language webinars to widen awareness. The members started sharing their documents online, and if you search for Komnet Abwasser, you will find, it's in German, you'll find the information they shared with each other, and IKT provided a help desk for them. Now, as I mentioned, fairly typical of actions taken by associations throughout the world to help their members. Initially, everybody was searching for the answers to how is this going to pan out? How does this virus behave? And it was the World Health Organization that, not surprisingly, emerged as the primary source of information. Also, the national bodies responsible for public health provided useful guidance. And as time has gone by, there's been a lot more information available, but during those initial stages, self-help was really the only way forward. So, if we look at the questions that have been asked over this year of trade associations by their water company members, in the early days they were mostly surrounding the transmission, the risk, and health and safety. Also, what to prioritize, what work could they give up, and what work should they continue with, how to organize their staff. And as regulatory requirements kept changing, a lot of questions out there about what this meant. By the middle of this year, the concern was more about availability of personal protective equipment. And then subsequently, it's been shifting, not surprisingly, towards impacts on revenue, what financial support is available to water utilities, and what's going to be the consequence for their operations in the future. Well, going back to what was initially known, the exact behavior of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was unknown. And to be honest, we're still discovering a lot of information about it. So all the initial deductions had to be based upon other coronaviruses and what was known. And so assumptions initially had to be made about the risks for water and sewage, and subsequently they proved correct. So that provides some reassurance that collectively we'll be able to respond quickly to the next pandemic when it comes along. Now, we looked around for guidance and advice, and actually one of the most comprehensive guides we found was a checklist that's been produced by the US Environment Protection Agency. It's their incident accident checklist for pandemic incidents, and that divided up the actions into 3 stages: preparing for the pandemic, responding to a pandemic, and recovering from it. So preparing, in a way, it's still ongoing because situations change and national regulations change. So those have to be thought through. But mostly what is happening at the moment is responding to the pandemic. We're not in a recovery phase yet. So when I say we're not in the recovery phase yet, we still really don't know how this is going to pan out. So we're in stage 2. We don't have vaccines commonly available yet. There is no cure, and further waves of infection are expected. Now, it wasn't known initially what it was going to look like. It appears, certainly from what was happening at the moment in the UK and Germany, that we're in this situation here. We're somewhere on the rise in a major winter spike, and we do not know going forward without intervention how this is going to turn out. So, looking at preparing for the pandemic, there's 5 actions here which summarize, and these are the principal actions again from that EPA document, what needs to be done. Planning the response, i.e. organising the teams, organising the staff, organising the way forward. Ensuring employees are protected. Maintaining essential operations. How are the essential operations going to be identified and continue to operate? What were the key facilities that had to be maintained? And how was the communication to be conducted for all of this, bearing in mind that there were all these restrictions moving in? And what's covered in the next slides applies equally to the water companies as it does to the supply chain, including the trenchless technology providers. Well, the typical planning actions: creating a team to lead the response, updating the response plans. Now, really, nobody's response plans, which existed, really anticipated exactly what was going to happen in terms of lockdowns, shutting downs of business, disruptions to the supply chain, and for many businesses, losing all of their income overnight. Reviews of information technology, the hardware, the software, how we're going to communicate, and also just ensuring how your staff were going to be able to continue to work under national regulations, for example, what counted as being essential services. Now, when it came to protecting employee health, you need to review your existing rules, ensure personal hygiene, ensure the supply of protective equipment, but particularly checking all the way through that the employees understood what they had to do. And for those who didn't have to be out there in public contact or working in the field, arranging home working and other social distancing measures became important. For us managing essential operations, it was a case of identifying what jobs needed to be staffed in order to keep the operations running. What were the critical activities that had to be undertaken? Also, who are the critical customers? The hospitals and other facilities that absolutely had to be kept online for supply of water and wastewater. And then finally, supporting all of that was finding alternative staff. So trawling through the staff in water companies and others who perhaps had past experience of running pumping systems or running a treatment works or a distribution network, who perhaps now are doing just jobs but might be available to be pulled back if needed. And when it came to the facilities, clearly there's pumps, tankers, valves, etc., which need to be maintained, but also what equipment was needed to maintain them, what supplies were needed. So there's a lot of activity, of course, as we know, around working with suppliers, developing the systems and finding alternative sources and creating stockpiles if necessary. So continuing with the theme of stage 1, the final element of that was the communication. So what needs to be communicated to customers and others, and how to set up those. And particularly, I think one of the main lessons that came out of this was a realization that perhaps traditional ways of raising revenue or collecting revenue from customers would have to change, and that online payment was perhaps going to have to be created as the new norm. Well, when we look at then about how there was a response to the pandemic, we've covered several of those items as well. So the plans are in place. So now it's all about protecting your employees' health, maintaining the operations and facilities, doing the communication. But there was also an important one, was actually recording what went on, particularly for those water companies that are in a heavy regulatory regime in terms of finance or environmental protection or performance in terms of customer complaints. They needed to really understand what happened so that they could subsequently argue the case with regulators if there were likely to be penalties for what had taken place. So this is the sort of stage where most of the sewer network operators are currently at. And when we look at a key issue that actually cropped up for many organizations was actually getting their staff recognized as being essential workers. And this wasn't recognized everywhere. So you have guys out trying to maintain water and sewer supplies getting stopped by the police. You get angry reactions from the public, seeing people working in the road saying, "You're going to give us this disease, what are you doing here?" And having to explain to them that actually it was essential that their water and their sewerage was maintained. And then in many cases as well, it was necessary to be an essential worker in order for staff to be able to work if there was childcare or free movement or even testing services available for essential workers only. So when it came to protecting the health of staff, these are the sorts of things that were going on: outside team meetings for field staff, for office staff, one man per vehicle, or having two men on a vehicle, but keeping the vehicles separated and the team separated, so one lot went down with the disease, others wouldn't, and maintaining social distancing rules when working. In offices and in laboratories, the same thing, having to maintain the distance. And right down to a couple of pictures from IKT here, we were able to maintain some training, but reduced numbers of people and distance between them, and a very simple ruse here on the right to ensure that only one person was using the conveniences at a time. Now, keeping staff informed about the risks cropped up. Partway through the year, it was announced in the press that it was going to be possible to test for coronavirus in sewage because coronavirus had been found in sewage. Now, this caused consternation, and right across Europe, trade associations and others were having to deal with concerned staff and their families, saying, "What's all this about coronavirus being in sewage?" Unfortunately, what had happened was the initial press releases had not explained that it was just the genetic material found, not the live virus. And that caused quite a lot of trouble. Of course, I touched upon what happened with PPE. Nobody had enough, there were shortages, it was discovered the supply chain was fragile and that the existing reserves were not robust. So a lot of lessons learned there for future pandemics. Now, an issue and really interesting development, of course, was home working. There were issues to start with, what hardware to use, what software to use, whether there are any human resource or health and safety issues. But actually, a lot of staff have discovered that they like working from home and were able to continue to work from home and do their roles. They have fewer interruptions. And actually, there are a number of studies out there which have shown that productivity and innovation actually can improve with people working from home. There's a reduction in office costs, but some equipment costs for equipping people to work from home. But the really big thing I think has come out of it is this online communication, surge in use. Now, the water sector is pretty conservative, and over the years, many people have been trying to say, let's communicate online rather than having to have endless meetings and traveling halfway across the country in order to have sales meetings and project meetings. But they've actually discovered, most water companies, that it works well. The communications are faster. There's also, for them, a pleasing reduction in costs for conducting meetings, for traveling, for training. So when we go back to the operations themselves, some water and sewage companies manage to maintain activities and some reduce them. It depends a lot on the national rules. Um, the things which are stopped tend to be the routine maintenance and investment works, including some sewer rehabilitation work. And what had to be maintained was urgent maintenance, blockages and collapses. So there were some trenchless technologies became important there. And there were design tasks which could be still undertaken, which were office-based. Now, looking particularly at contractors and what has happened there is that in some cases contractors haven't been able to work or they've had to reduce their active staff. But there's been a sort of a knock-on impact has been felt with in terms of contractual arrangements, a sort of more flexibility on both sides, contractors and clients, better ways of dealing with deadlines, not applying financial penalties for delays, extensions to delivery times, consequences, financial and otherwise, of delays, more interruptions allowed or suspension of work. But there has been some postponement of tenders or offers during the period. Critical for the water and sewage companies themselves, though, is what's happened with their funding. Around the world, customers got mixed messages. So water companies have been instructed variously by governments not to increase charges or to reduce charges, to defer payments, or even make water free, and no mandatory reconnection. So there's been a reduced incentive of customers to pay. And then there have been changes to revenue. So commercial and industrial revenue dropped during closures, domestic revenue went up. If you are a water company in a city, no commuters, no tourists. In the rural areas, more domestic use from people staying at home, but less tourists. So different impacts felt in different places. And there's been this need for new methods of payment. So you can't have people visiting offices, making face-to-face payments. Cash payment became difficult. Access to banks has been difficult. And so new systems are needed with the online systems. Online banking, there's been a surprising increase in that throughout all around the world. And but of course, customers do need to be encouraged to pay. The impact has been interesting. The World Bank recently reported that a 10 to 40% reduction in revenues, and as high as 70 to 80% in case of some of the water companies that they were dealing with. So they've created spreadsheet tools. Latin American bank has had a similar experience. And in Europe, the Acqua Pubblica Europa, which is a trade association dealing with publicly funded water and sewage companies, said their members have reported a 10 to 15% reduction in income. And as a consequence, having to stop part or all of investment. So what's the result of that has been that in many countries, the trade associations representing the sectors have been raising issues of financial support on behalf of their members. Public finances are going to be under strain for some years to come. So it's apparent that water and sewage companies are going to have to find ways of smarter ways of delivering their services for less money. And of course, trenchless technology has some advantages here. I've mentioned communication with regulators and keeping records. That's been a key as well, a lesson learned. So particularly if you've got activities that had to be stopped, you had to keep them informed, keeping them aware of issues. And that's another place where trade associations have been important, working on behalf of their members to raise such issues and deal with authorities collectively. So going on this theme of associations and what has happened there, with the current situation, it's really highlighted that associations have a role to play if there is a change in advice relating to transmission. They've got a really good job to play for their members in signposting changes in national regulation, lobbying government and regulators on behalf of members about public health, financial support, environmental regulation. And last but not least, providing access to experts who can give the advice that is needed. And what's been fundamental to that? Well, the embracing of online communication, such as we're doing today. You can't hold face-to-face meetings. Online is likely to become the new normal. Working from home is now acceptable. You can now undertake meetings daily, weekly, or monthly. So in Germany, the Commonwealth Abwasser now meets every Friday. And in the UK, the Sewer Rehab Contact Group, which met 3 times a year, now meets every month online. But the converse side is that conference organisers are experiencing problems with events. So major events like the German IKT exhibition should have taken place this year. It's now not going to take place until 2 years' time when otherwise expected. And in the UK STT, its annual No Dig event was put back from September to next March, and it's now being put back from next March to June. And a major outcome, I think, is going to be we're going to see more automation and remote working on sewer networks. And this is where all companies have the opportunity to learn from each other nationally and internationally. There's going to be a lot of innovation and development, and basically water and sewage companies are going to be more receptive to new ideas. What next? This is the final slide. The situation's still evolving. The disruption is going to be long term. There's a lot more information and data that's going to emerge. So keeping an eye on what's going on internationally and nationally is going to be important. Creating or joining networks of organizations which can answer questions of mutual interest is probably the best way forward. That has really emerged from the lessons learned from this pandemic so far. And different countries are at different stages, so there's a lot to learn, therefore, from each other. So we talk of a new normal when this is over, after the pandemic. The new normal is already here. It's coping with the pandemic whilst having to make tough decisions about water industry investment and operations. And essentially, going forward, most water and sewage companies are going to have to find new ways to continue to deliver their essential services for less money.